He was a heavy metal icon who influenced a generation of artists and many more. Ozzy Osbourne passed away earlier this week at the age of 76. The world would come to know the bat-biting, self-styled Prince of Darkness, though, as a family man and a far deeper and more complex figure than many perceived. For a look back at Ozzy and his legacy, contributing editor of Rolling Stone magazine, Anthony DeCurtis, and he's also a music historian with decades of experience. He's been following the industry. Anthony, thank you very much for being here. Ozzy was inducted to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice, first as a member of Black Sabbath and again as a solo artist. Only 27 people have held that distinction. Many credit him as sort of the creator, or one of the creators, of heavy metal. What was his impact on music, and how big was his influence?
Well, his influence, which continues, by the way, is very, very full, complete, comprehensive. You know, it extends much beyond even metal, although he absolutely was one of the founders of heavy metal, one of the designers of what that sound was. And but you know, on the other hand, you know, the other night you get someone like Lady Gaga playing Ozzy's song "Crazy Train" in her set as a kind of tribute to him. So you know, you have somebody that had that massive influence musically, at the same time as, you know, with his TV show, The Osbourne, had a massive influence in that aspect of culture as well. So. You know, even though Ozzy was not necessarily somebody with, you know, the kind of ambitions to be, you know, a kind of, you know, a culturally significant figure, he absolutely was.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. Just as he always struck me as a fairly humble guy who never expected this, and, you know, kind of always never forgot where he came from. What is something that people don't appreciate about Ozzy, or a misperception about him?
Well, you know, there's so many aspects of that. For example, the fact that the Beatles were his biggest influence. You know, he was kind of a Beatles nut. And when, you know, he met Paul McCartney, he was just beside himself. You know, so there was never a sense in which, you know, he, you know, for all of his excesses and all of the things that, you know, outrages that we know about, you know, he was somebody who was very kind. And I think his fans always felt that warmth from him, even at the very beginning, when, you know, he could be described almost as a kind of satanic figure.
Yeah, he was controversial, certainly. But he kind of went from the Ozzy who, you know, made the music that your mother told you not to listen to being on a reality TV show that your mother probably would watch and would laugh at. Do you think that he ultimately, in his later years, found himself more comfortable as being known as the dad and the husband, rather than the rock god and the Prince of Darkness?
I think he took each step as it came. I don't think he was particularly uncomfortable with it before, but no one ever thought to think about it. But, you know, Sharon Osbourne, his wife, both kind of stabilized his personal life. I mean, I'm sure we all know about Ozzy's many, many problems with drugs and alcohol. You know, she saw him through all that and then really guided him through that television show, which, you know, introduced him, as you say, you know, from the person that your parents, you know, warned you about, to the person that you could sit with your parents and watch the show about him.
Yeah, you certainly can't talk about Ozzy without talking about Sharon, who he was married to for 43 years. I remember when he was introduced by President George W. Bush at the White House Correspondents' Dinner in 2002 or 2003, and the crowd roared. And he just, he looked like he was a man who had sort of rediscovered himself and was always so humble. What do you think, when people look back, that they would remember him for the most? What do you think that legacy is?
Well, I think the primary legacy, of course, is musical, because without that, we don't have anything. But, you know, musically, you know, all of the bands that opened for Black Sabbath, the reunited Black Sabbath that, you know, performed a couple of weeks ago for their final show, Guns N' Roses, for example, like all of those bands, all of the bands that came out of Seattle, even as they weren't considered metal bands, all listened to Ozzy. So that's number one.
Yeah.
Number two is the TV show. That is something that so many artists have now, no one else was willing to, let a crew come into their personal lives the way Ozzy did. And now everyone does it. So, we're not, he is the Prince of Darkness, but he's going to shine on for a while, I think.
I think he certainly will, and I used to watch the show all the time, and certainly listen to the music in the 80s. And he wasn't a Satanist. A lot of people also thought that he was some sort of satanic figure. He believed in God. He talked about his belief in God. He was a baptized Christian, and again, I just go back to the fact that he always seemed to never forget where he came from and sort of those humble beginnings and the fans. Well, thank you so much. Go ahead. One quick last comment.
No, I was just going to say, absolutely. And that's why, his final show was in his hometown. He never did forget and never would forget.
Rolling Stone Magazine's Anthony DeCurtis. Sir, thank you very much. We really appreciate you being here. And in the words of Ozzy, rock and roll.
Appreciate it.
Information. Truth is freedom. Is Newsmax. It's real news for real people.